We are joined with the one, the only, best in the business, Mark Sleboda. He's international relations security analyst. You can find Mark on Boosty at Real Political Mark Sleboda, or you can just put in his name. Both of those things will bring up the man himself. How you doing, Mark? You doing okay this morning? Well, it's afternoon for you.
Yeah, I'm alive tomorrow. How the hell are you? Thanks for
I am
having
doing
me.
okay.
It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on the show.
It's always an honor and a pleasure to have you, man. I was just having a conversation about Putin's Valdai speech, and not necessarily to delve further into it, but I am curious on your take on it. Give me your thoughts on that speech.
Okay, so my first thought is once again how formidable a statesman and a leader Putin is. He
Agreed.
is educated, eloquent, ridiculously well informed about everything, able to discuss serious events in the world at a in a level of geopolitics and international relations. Right? He's not even speaking. He's not pandering to a domestic base or anything like that. He is speaking at a high level about things occurring, not only involving Russia, but in the world, and the the trend towards a multipolar world, in a way that I don't think any other statesman in the world is able to regularly discuss these things. He's able to field questions on these and other topics to again, an uncomparable degree for hours, right? With comfort, with confidence, with dare I say, a bit of charm and humor as well. He quotes poetry from Pushkin, right?
Yes.
On the Battle of Borodino, right?
Yes.
Making points on current Russian French relations, over the conflict in Ukraine. He quotes, not quotes. He issues statements, proverbs, sayings in Latin, right, to punctuate his points home. Tell me another leader in the world at that level that can speak, with such confidence, not reading off of a teleprompter, not floundering around and repeating, hash talking points and so forth. It makes me proud, right, to be a Russian, right? I'm like, our leader is heads and above a statesman, and an intellectual, above all others that I'm aware of. And my second thought was he didn't actually say that much that was new, right? The Kremlin did build up this speech beforehand, like the whole world was waiting, and this was going to be a very important speech. And I didn't get. I mean, there's plenty to discuss there, but there's nothing new. There's no new Russian stance. There's no revelations that I was not aware of before. He just eloquently presented things as they are occurring and Russia's position. Once again, without any, not a single backstep, nothing like that. But at the same time, he doesn't resort to, demonization or crude verbiage against other leaders that Russia is involved in a conflict with. I think he does indeed use sarcasm in a way, but it's in a very polite way. Again, specifically towards Macron and talking about him thinking he's Napoleon, and so forth. But it is done in a way that is, only very indirectly mocking him, right? On the face, he was very extremely polite. And he never publicly disparages other world leaders. And I almost get the sense, him saying that Trump does it all the time, right? Trump flips on a dime and is screaming about him 1 minute and the next, and all of these, European leaders and everything. And Russia just has a different political culture. Mm-hmm. They don't pander to some nationalist base, at least not on the presidential level, right? Okay, so there are other people that are allowed to play the role of bad cop, Dmitry Medvedev and so forth underneath. But the Russian president is expected by Russian political culture to be above that, or at least Putin has solidified that so much in the last 25 years in various forms of power that it has become so. Yeah. So he doesn't wade in the muck, right, and throw feces around the way that shall we say, Donald Trump and European leaders do, even when Russia is involved in what even it's quite clear it regards as an existential conflict with them. But he also, I think, very correctly talked about the state of the conflict, right? Not only in strategic terms, but even in tactical terms, of how combat is occurring on the front line without any kind of, with confidence, like with our winning, but without, they did some damage. They do this, we do this. This is, why we're winning. This is what is working. It's a cost, right? But we're confident, we're confident in our military and so forth. And again, there is no one else, all these Western leaders who continually go off on the topic of the conflict in Ukraine without the honesty and without the correct analytical way of talking about it that Putin does.
Agreed. 1,000% agreed. Is Putin going to get couped?
What?
Is Putin going to... One of the commentators, Dr. O, was having a conversation about Putin's speech when it became around Trump. And he was making this point of saying that Putin was being too amenable to Donald Trump. And because there are two things in his speech, right? When he is making the point of saying, I don't believe the war would have taken place if Donald Trump was in office. Trump listens, he's this, he's that. Where he was being far more brutal to the Europeans. And Dr. Rowe's point, to summarize it, was basically, this is being too weak. And because he's being too weak, there may be an uprising to overthrow Putin. Now, I don't buy this, right? But I am curious on how was that taken. Dr. Rowe is typically pretty good. And he's typically, I think this was more ballistic on his part. But what was that take on him talking about the U.S. and the U.S.'s role and some of the hijinks that are taking place in comparison to being somewhat amicable to Donald Trump against, let's say, the Europeans, for example?
Yeah, I'm sorry. When you first said "coup," using it as a verb, I just had a picture of a bunch of pigeons flocking around Putin going "coup, coup." It's like,
would that be a putsch attempt? Let's use that term, right?
So is this what the alt media is talking about this weekend? Okay. All right.
That's what some of the alt media is talking about.
Yeah. First of all, let me just say that I try my best to make it a policy that I don't talk about other analysts, journalists, commentators in the alt media directly, at least not when I have something not positive to say about them. I don't think that's constructive. We're all supposed to be more or less on the same side,
right?
Okay, and I try not to do that. I think it's
and I don't want you to. I'm just
a professional courtesy. So that being said, I don't always agree with many other analysts and journalists and commentators in the alt media sphere. I've had a very different take on this conflict, I think, than a lot of them from the very beginning. I mean, there are others that I've been more or less in lockstep with the other time. Hi, Brian. So there are very few other figures in the alt media that I listen to. on a regular basis. There are some, but there are very few.
Right.
Because not only do I have to, I mean, I don't necessarily have to agree with them, but I have to appreciate, their position, and I have to learn something, because otherwise it's simply
What's
not
the
worth
point?
my time, right? Because I don't have that much of it, if only because of that reason. So I don't always stay abreast of the latest alt media gossip of who's saying what and so forth. But I think that's probably a good thing. I think there is a considerable portion of the alt media sphere that pinned certain hopes on Donald Trump and the possibility of some radical foreign policy change in the United States, particularly via the conflict in Ukraine, and have been backpedaling and justifying and apologizing and so forth ever since, and have been trying to justify and continue, shall we say, hoping against hope and that sort of thing. And it's also my position to not do hope. That hope is the death of analysis, right? As a journalist or an activist, you're free to do hope. As an analyst, I think it's the death of analysis. So I think you should be very careful not to project what you want to happen onto what is actually happening, right? This degree of confirmation bias and a lack of objectivity. And I think I'm perfectly capable of holding a political and geopolitical position, but not letting it, or trying, I should say, trying my best not to let it affect my analysis. Others, I don't think necessarily follow that extremely well. No, there is zero chance of a coup in Russia. Just it's ridiculous to whoever suggested it, and I'm not saying any, I don't know because I didn't hear it. But if someone is suggesting that, it's absurd. It may be the way they feel. And they're, maybe they talk to a few people in Russia, that are impatient or have similar feelings, right? But that does not represent the Russian political class. It doesn't represent the Russian population. It's not representative of anything. I mean, you can always find a few people that will agree with you, particularly lawyers, on anything, right? I mean, but this is not the case. This is not realistic. I'm certain there are people within the Russian military and the Russian political elite that do disagree with Putin on certain things, but that's it. They may disagree, but there is a power vertical in Russia, right? Putin is a very efficient manager. He listens to everyone out, but then he makes a decision and he goes forward. He has a policy. And we can criticize all we want, but Putin has been perfectly willing to admit when he has made a mistake, such as Ukraine in 2014 and 2015 and the Minsk agreements, right? And very few other leaders are willing to do that. And Putin has the people's trust, and he has the political elite's trust in that no one can manage the differences in the Russian elite like he can. That's his signature skill. Not only does he appeal to the Russian population on a charismatic and intellectual level, but he manages the Russian elite. I mean, it's not a dictatorship in the way that it is usually presented, that Putin makes all the decisions. No, he manages the various, competing interests and different institutions and bodies of political power and economic power and everything extremely well. There is no... If something, God forbid, happened to Putin, say, I don't know, Budanov managed to fucking kill him or something like that, then it would be difficult. But a next leader would have to try to make himself into Putin again. That is, what it is. He has become an institution. And I think that going forward, all future Russian leaders will then have to model their behavior on him. After Putin. It's not that there can't be anyone following Putin, but even after Putin is gone, it will have to be another Putin, right?
It would be hard to conceive
So,
at this point.
I mean, he has an understanding of what is going on in the conflict the way that I think few other political leaders and analysts do. Certainly, he has access to intelligence that none of us do. So all of our armchair quarterbacking, our particularly impatience and that sort of thing. I have felt it at times myself. And when he continues this diplomatic game with Trump, right, rather than just telling him off, like the way the Russian ambassador to the UK, who is allowed to do such things, did in the last week. He was conducting an interview in English in the Western, with a Western journalist, and the journalist pointed out that Trump is very annoyed, very angry, very upset with Putin. And the response of the Russian ambassador to the UK was, "And so what?" He's allowed to do. The Russian president has, is engaging in this diplomatic game for reasons of dealing with, what is a desperate but still potent lashing out of a dying hegemon, and managing that relation, and in Trump, because of his unique ego and narcissism, he is manipulatable to a degree that U.S. presidents usually are not. He invites it, he courts it. That's what he wants, right? Everyone is supposed to come to court and pay court to him. That's the way that he sets up his own administration and his relations with all other leaders in the world, right? And Putin is playing that game, although, perhaps from a privileged position of someone who is a peer, or at least very nearly a peer, and he does it from that position. And I get annoyed when I hear Putin playing Trump or playing to him, right, and not responding with shall we say more
brutality.
I don't know, emotion or realism or something of the sort. But that he's the Russian president, and that's what he's doing. And again, there are greater reasons for doing it, and international diplomacy and keeping China and India and Brazil and Indonesia and all of these other BRICS countries, online, and keeping the Middle East powers that are technically U.S. allies like Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Qatar also having very good relations with Russia, and despite what they're doing with the U.S., refusing to side in the geopolitical conflict against Russia. That's a management act, and he has to always, in diplomatic terms, keep that in mind when he's talking and when he's making decisions about what exactly Russia is doing in Ukraine. And he has done it with a diplomatic skill, again, that no one else in the world is capable of, as far as a statesman is capable of. He is the statesman of our generation. There are others. I mean, Xi Jinping is great, of course, and others. But I mean,
no, Putin's a different level.
Nothing in the same category. So no, there is zero chance of a coup against Putin. That is projection, as far as I'm concerned, and it's nonsense.
Just be clear, though, this is an acknowledgement that Trump has, what's the word I'm looking for? A, power. B, that he has latitude. In that office, meaning there's a space in which he can operate that can make life even more miserable for these people or better off. Let's get into the war for a bit. There seems to be an energy war taking place. Now, one of the things that Putin mentioned, he points out how, I think he used Jupiter and the moon as an example, effectively, of saying, how is the U.S. buying uranium from us? But they're taking issue.
This is where he quoted Latin. And I cannot quote the Latin expression. I appreciate the erudite quality of anyone who can. It has never been one of my gifts. But he says essentially, what is permitted to Jupiter, meaning Zeus, right, the god of the Greeks and the Romans, that the head of the god, is not permitted to a cow. And it's a way of simply pointing out that there are different power levels, and yes, there is a different standard in between, two different things. And the U.S. as the hegemon is allowed to be hypocritical because it has the power, and that's the expression. It was a wonderful expression, of course, and again, I think it shows the level, the intellectual level that Putin is operating above, so far above this absolutely worthless chaff that is the political elite in Europe and the United States. I mean, I'm sorry, you can say, I mean, Donald Trump is a character, right? He represents the American people, I think. I mean, he is. I actually did. Back when I was doing my postgraduate work at the LSE in London, I was doing Model United Nations and its more modern spin-off security councils, right? Where you create a geopolitical scenario and have different rooms with the security states of each different country making decisions that are effectively moderated by the staff that decides what's happening, right, in a conflict or a crisis situation. And one of the situations I ran was a civil war. This was in 2011. Was a civil war in Ukraine with Russia and NATO entering on both sides. And I decided that Donald Trump was the president of the United States.
Are you serious?
I did. If you'll remember, Donald Trump ran before his first administration, right? Before that, right? And he didn't have any success, right? He didn't follow through. This was back in, what was it, 2008? Back then. Yeah, 2010. Yeah. And I decided that at some future day, I thought Donald Trump is the perfect representation of the American people. In my fictional scenario, I was going to make him the U.S. president, and that he was going to be manipulated by the neocons in his own administration, including John McCain, who were running a covert war against Russia in Ukraine under his nose. That was the scenario I ran. But of course, it turned out that Donald Trump did become the president. And I think in a way, he is the ultimate representation of democracy, which is why I'm extremely cynical of democracy. I'm cynical of everything, of course, right? So take that for what it's worth. I'm far more concerned with meritocracy than I am with democracy. But ultimately, the American people wanted to be entertained. And that's why they elected a former reality TV and business huckster as their president. And again, that quote to me that sums up Trump perfectly from the movie Gladiator, with Maximus on the floor of one of the arenas after vanquishing his opponent, turning to the crowd and, "Are you not entertained? Is that not why you are here? Are you not entertained?" Right? And then the applause comes, right? And that to me is Trump. I've never seen anything represent him better than that. So he has to be dealt with, but he's not, in any sense of the word, what I would consider a formidable or intelligent or, even, we're going to talk Erdogan, cunning world leader. He is bluff and bluster and, a lack of any serious intelligence or education in a position that is so far above, as still, if fading, the most powerful, richest country in the world by some measures, right? Some others not anymore. China, hi. But he has to be dealt with. He has to be dealt with. He has to be managed. And Putin does that better than anyone. Everyone tries to manipulate Trump, including people within his own administration. And again, he invites that, right? He likes his narcissism, his ego being flattered and fed to and everything. But there are ways to do it that are completely ineffective, Zelensky, and just come across as grating. And Putin has a much more subtle, I think, way of dealing. And, as a former intelligence operative himself, I'm sure that he has a psychological profile of Trump that is constantly updated, and how to play things and say certain things and make reference to certain domestic things in the United States, like vote recounts and things like that matter so much
Charlie
on
Kirk.
a person, much on a personal level to Trump, and thus allow a degree of personal manipulation. I think Putin's comments, for instance, on climate change, which are completely at odds with statements that he himself made previously on the issue, and of the position of the Russian Academy of Sciences and Roshydromet, the Russian, science hydrometeorological institution, which are, fully recognizing climate change, what's happening, the anthropogenic quality, and how indeed, catastrophic it is. But then you have, previously, it's not so much right now because it's not really an issue anymore, but particularly during Trump's first administration, Putin made several kind of side comments in the presence of Trump about it that were clearly at odds with things that Putin had said previously, and they were about playing Trump. And I didn't like to hear that, because climate change is a very important issue at an international relations and security, let alone nature level, to me.
Yes.
And I didn't like it, seeing what I consider such a catastrophic issue abused for geopolitical manipulation in that way. But I was also capable of recognizing what Putin is doing.
Yeah, so the way I took Putin's speech was that he was trying to create a separation between Europe and Trump. That it was almost,
he's always trying to do it.
Yeah, but that's the way I took the speech, though. I didn't see it as him being weak. I took it as him being a diplomat. This notion of, Europe is failing, Europe is falling apart, all of these things are wrong with Europe. Donald Trump, he's here to, he listened, we had conversations, I can work with him, et cetera, trying to create a wedge between these two things, meaning if there's any fault lines between these two things, I am doing my best to create a wedge.
At the end of the day, it may not work out, but that doesn't mean that it is not worth the attempt to try to find that wedge and exploit it, right? And again, even if it is not successful in further widening the transatlantic divide, right? And again, during the first administration, there really was a transatlantic divide. I mean, it was talked about. It was right. And the Europeans hated Trump, and Trump hated the Europeans, and there was no question about that. In this second administration, the Europeans have decided, in a way, how to deal with Trump, right, to prevent that transatlantic divide from re-widening, reigniting at a more even critical time. And that's by being completely servile sycophants to Trump and just rolling over, showing their bellies, and agreeing with everything he says, while they then try to manipulate the events and the situation around him. That's quite clearly what is going on. Putin understands that. We'll always try to find that wedge. But once again, even if there is little chance of that actually paying dividends, fruit, it still has diplomatic fruit via the other major BRICS powers, that Putin is showing that he is the diplomatic one. He has, in this respect, the moral high ground. And if India and China and Turkey and other countries were not buying Russian energy and resources and commodities, and also providing avenues, for import substitution and getting things into Russia that Russia does need, then it would be a very different conflict. Russia would be, I'm not saying that, I think Russia would probably have, if we go back to the beginning and redid everything with China and India and other countries to various levels, stopping trade with Russia, we wouldn't be in the position that we are today. I think it would have ended much sooner in terms not favorable to Russia, right? More what the U.S. wanted. So a lot of people, kind of disregard that. And again, there is a tendency in the alt media to perhaps imagine out of a desire, out of a good desire for more unity among non-Western powers than there necessarily is, right? We all want there to be more unity, but I think you also need to be realistic about the degree of unity and how that conflicts at various points with national interest of the respective countries that do indeed have very different national interests.
Yeah.
And it's an important thing to keep in mind when you understand, again, the wider diplomatic game that Putin is playing, not just with Trump, not just with Europe, but with the whole world.
Before I flip over to the war itself, this quote that Putin did, or the comment where he said, pirates will be destroyed. And this was in relation to Macron or France stealing the boat. Of course, there was the thing with Estonia trying to board one of the Russian ships that was warded off by a Russian fighter jet. How serious is he about that? This idea that, look, this is a no-no. You're not going to steal boats. You're not going to grab these things in international waters. This is a no-no. This is not going to happen. We will destroy pirates. Effectively saying all of these countries are on notice for doing this.
I think that is probably on a balance between a real threat and shall we say a bit of bluster. I think that's probably a little bit more on the bluster and bluff side. Again, it depends on the situation. If we take a look at the ship, the Barkane or something, I don't have the exact pronunciation of the word, the tanker that was stopped. This was not a Russian ship. This was not a Russian flag ship. It was not even a Russian flag of convenience ship, right? It was flagged out of Benin. It had a Chinese captain. It had other crew. It was going to India, as far as I understand. That's the reports I have seen. I haven't seen anything to contradict that. I know some people think that because it was a Chinese captain, it was going to China. But I mean, I remember reading somewhere that it was going to India. But how can Russia effectively respond to that? Right? It is an act of piracy. It is an act against the freedom of navigation that for years the West trots out when it's parading their militaries up and down China's coast and other countries. We're here to protect freedom of navigation. The only threats to freedom of navigation for the last couple of decades have been the West, right? And the repeated acts of piracy against countries like Iran and North Korea, and now Trump blowing boats out of international waters because they must be drug dealers. He says so, and that should be good enough for everybody in the Caribbean. That is, I think, quite obviously, Russia and China and others need to get together a fleet and actually protect freedom of navigation from Western countries. Of course, that's not, unfortunately, in the cards. The way the current naval situation in the world works out. But what does Russia do in that situation? Because it's not their ship. It's carrying oil from one of their companies to a company in India. But is it going to go to war because Macron delayed that ship for a few days, which he admitted, had nothing to do with drones. He says it is part of a strategy to, not to necessarily seize these ships, but to delay them and create problems for them and further insurance problems to make the business model unsustainable. And what is he's talking about there? Just last week, a number came out. I reported it on my own channel that the Western sources consider that 17% of the world's maritime oil shipping industry is now part of the shadow fleet, or now it became the dark fleet, right? In some British publication, right? Again, what does that mean? It means it's not under their control because it's not insured in London. And most of these ships, right? Russia has grown its fleet, right? It has flagships, right? It has grown. It has others that are parts of flags of convenience, but still the majority of the ships involved in trade with Russia are just part of the maritime shipping industry. They can make money by sending their ship to pick up Russian oil and move it somewhere else. And that's why they're doing it. It is pure capitalism, right, of a globalized nature. It has nothing to do with being pro-Russian or anti-Western or anything of the sort. So in those situations, when it occurs to one of those ships, what are Russia's options, right? Not so much. It can't maintain a permanent Russian naval convoy all the way from the Baltic Sea through the Mediterranean and the Suez Canal. That's not a possibility either. So I think more, if you take in Putin's wider comments, I think even more he was saying, okay, Macron, do what you're going to do. Let's see how it works out for you. Because, of course, interdicting regular ships like that is going to have a cost on the French side or the other Western countries as well. They don't have huge navies. They are extremely expensive to maintain and to operate in this way, and it will disrupt shipping in many ways off their own coast. So I think that is more likely. Now, if they were to try to actually say blockade the Baltic Sea and let no ships through, or more significantly, try to prevent the passage of Russian flagged tankers, that's another story altogether. And Russia would, in that case, be compelled to act in some way. And let's be clear, if you're stopping a Russian flagged merchant ship in international waters, right, which there is through the Baltic Sea, it's a narrow corridor, but by necessity, it is delineated. Then that is an act of war against Russia, an act of war, right? A direct, unquestionable act of war, which is why, in those particular situations, Russia sent, MiGs hurtling towards the Estonian mighty flotilla of patrol boats that were attempting to stop, and why, on the far side of France against an international flagged ship, what can Russian do but bitch about piracy? It's a different situation. So it is what is Russia's response is contextual to the ship involved, where it's flagged, what it's carrying, and where the interdiction takes place. And Macron is, I'm sure, well aware of that. So there is a gray area that he can do this in. And that's why he chose such a ship. And in, the place off the coast of France where Russia really can't do anything about it unless they want to start firing missiles into a NATO country. So there is a very complicated gray area. And this is obviously a weak point that can be pressed to a certain advantage. And Macron is obviously going to follow through on that, and other Western countries may follow through. And again, there is a point that they can, to a degree, successfully pursue this, and there are red lines there. Again, Russian flagged ships in a place where Russia can do something about it realistically. That is a different situation entirely. And that area between gray line and red line is now where we're going to be playing on this issue.
I